Throughout humankind's existence on this floating planet we call home, a few things are always certain. Death, taxes, stupid Twitter drama. But if there's one thing that humankind faces at some point in their life, is fear.
And much like my favorite saying nowadays, a lot of people over the years have capitalized on people's fear because inconveniencing people is absolutely hilarious. Yes, throughout the years, the genre of horror has been a staple of media for as long as said media has existed. If you were old enough to actually know Winston Churchill, obviously we had the classic monster movies of the 1920s and 1930s, the very first instance where horror was brought into the mainstream, where people wearing funny costumes made spooky sounds that wouldn't be able to be picked up on screen because microphones were a foreign concept at the time. Instead, we needed to read the fact that we needed to be scared. And this concept of plopping a bunch of moviegoers into the cinema just to have them bear witness to something that's supposed to scare the absolute shit out of them, only for the janitor to come in after everyone pissed off, leaving him to clean up said shit, was an obvious recipe for success. And I don't think I need to explain where this media went afterwards. From the inception of motion picture all the way to modern times with the funny clown that got bitch slapped to the point of slumber, horror movies have become as big of a staple of Hollywood cinema as any other major film genre.
You might be asking yourself, John, why are you spending so much time talking about horror movies? You're a gaming channel. And my response to that would be, shut the fuck up.
But obviously, as time has marched forward, so did improvements in technology, and some smartass thought to themselves, hey, Friday the 13th was the spooky in the theaters. What if we put you in the spooky?
Yes, this is now truly where the fun begins.
Now, since horror films were already such a popular concept, and with video games being the new hot thing at the time, some people thought it would be a good idea to take the horror setting and characters we've all fell in love with and translate that over to a media that we all can control, so we get to personally become the next slaughter victim to a disgruntled hockey player. I'm sure that's probably somebody's fetish, but as I'm sure if you've been opening your eyes and bearing witness to what's on screen and not just falling asleep to my soft and gentle voice, as a matter of fact, just so happen if you were, rise and shine, fuckface! You may notice that, yeah, this is not a spooky, because I'm pretty sure that consoles like the Atari and the NES just wasn't really capable of displaying the on-screen viscera and unsettling atmosphere that their film counterparts were able to achieve, primarily due to the fact that the technology just wasn't really there yet, which I think was one part bullshit because this was a game released on the NES, so if scaring you wasn't an option, maybe having you partake in a snuff film might just scratch that itch. So for the most part, while games based on these iconic horror films were being adapted to these at the time little new lunchboxes that made genocide of a shit ton of ducks appealing, they weren't really all that scary, which is one of the core ingredients as to what made the films they were trying to adapt so special in the first place. Now, obviously, I can't really talk for everyone. I was born during a time where we at the very least had been graced with two of the most iconic horror games made at the time that made the genre what it is today, so for all I know, this might have caused some people sleepless nights back in the days. Yeah, I always found pixels scary, but during this time where horror gaming was pretty much still trying to get its foot in the door, there was at least one game that released that is quite substantial, and you wouldn't particularly know the reason unless, like me, you've done a whole bunch of research, and that game was called Sweet Home, an RPG based on a Japanese horror film of the same name.
Unfortunately, haven't played this game yet. Most of my exposure to Sweet Home really came in the form of watching a video that some call me Johnny made on it a while ago.
But to my knowledge, it's a horror-themed RPG where a bunch of characters explore a mansion, fighting off a bunch of spooky nasties and solving some puzzles along the way. I honestly would love to play this for myself at some point, because I really do love delving into some forgotten horror gaming history. But the reason as to why I mentioned that this game was quite substantial during this odd time for horror gaming isn't necessarily the game itself, it's what the game eventually would end up inspiring. And after I mention a few keywords, I think you'll probably be able to put two and two together. So like I said, you play as a bunch of people exploring a mansion, fighting off a shit ton of different monsters while solving puzzles. And if those hints weren't enough for you, then let's glance over at the game's Wikipedia page and you'll see that this game was developed by Capcom. Now, I want you to keep those little nuggets of information in your head for a little while longer because we still have some ground to cover. Now, throughout this time frame, we've seen horror attempted to be adapted on the Atari 2600 as well as the NES, but there were some editions released on PCs at the time, like the Uninvited as well as this other game called Elvira Mysteries of the Dark, which looks like a turn of the decade PC game, I can tell you that much, so it fits the bill. But it was also here on the peasant PC Master Race side where we would get what is probably considered to be the founding father of the survival horror genre, 1992's Alone in the Dark, which I haven't played yet, but I've pretty much seen enough of this game to at the very least know what it inspired later. I mean, come on. Fixed camera angles, pre-rendered backgrounds, limited resources, characters that look like if a preschooler was taking a pottery class. It's pretty obvious to see what game this would end up inspiring an entire 4 years later.
So enough bullshit, let's finally get to the point, because apparently you don't really like getting your attention spans fixed.
Obviously, now as technology has advanced in both the PC and console space, it was pretty obvious that horror was starting to finally properly be able to represent it in this new interactive format. Games that were pretty substantial that were released during this time were 1993's The Seventh Guest and 1995's Clock Tower, probably two of the most beloved horror games that were released during this time. But now, before I get into the main star of this video, I would also like to ask this. Between this odd time period of the 1980s to 1995, what was the overall public response to horror games? Were they actually a rather popular way to get a horror fix, or were they just seen as a small niche that didn't really end up doing anything for anybody? Because I'm not too sure if these were really thought to be able to make a splash like it did in the mid-90s. So if anybody has any information on what people thought about horror games back then, please leave them in the comments so that I don't have to read them, but appreciate the effort that you took to get that information to me either way. But enough beating around the bush. Despite me not knowing if horror gaming ever really made a splash when it was first introduced on consoles like the Atari or NES, that would all change when Sony released their first ever console into the world, as well as this little game simply known as Resident Evil. I could really just end this portion of the video here because we all know what Resident Evil is. This game is the reason that we have the entire survival horror genre in the first place, and it's quite fitting because to my knowledge and according to this Google search, Resident Evil was the first game in existence to use that term, and the rest is pretty much history. What's there to say about this game that already hasn't been? It set the standard for every single game that came after. Creepy setting and enemies, check. Limited inventory, check. Limited reserve so you can defend your ass, check. Great voice acting.
Oh, Barry!
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
Check! And not only, as I'm sure you know, was Resident Evil a great game just in general, it was pretty much the first game to really break the horror genre into gaming out of its niche status and propelled it straight into the mainstream. Horror now became a staple of gaming, and that's pretty damn cool. And ever since the monumental success of Resident Evil, obviously there were a shit ton of games that attempted to jump on the hype train with varying degrees of success, but none of them really came close to what Capcom was able to achieve back in 1996. And unfortunately for these clones, things wouldn't really get any better because Capcom was just keeping that momentum going after releasing 2 sequels as well as 1 spin-off so fans could get their survival horror fix almost instantly. I also find it funny too that the game that inspired Resident Evil had no choice but to take inspiration from the franchise that it inspired, with Alone in the Dark: The New Nightmare being completely overshadowed by the one series it helped put on the map. But you didn't just think we were gonna give the spotlight over to Resident Evil for how it revolutionized survival horror and made it a mainstream genre in gaming. No, throughout this endless ocean of games trying to mooch off the success of Resident Evil, there was one game that was able to break the mold and become equally as influential to bringing horror gaming to the mainstream as much as Resident Evil. Now, much like Resident Evil, I think Silent Hill needs equally as little of an introduction. Konami's answer to Resident Evil, Silent Hill took a lot of what made Resident Evil the influential franchise it was, but also had its own spin to make it truly unique. You see, whereas survival horror mechanics are still present in Silent Hill, the themes and horror that you'll encounter in this little foggy town plays a lot more of the psyche of your main character, and this brand of horror is simply known as psychological horror. This idea of not just having to battle enemies in order to survive survive, but having these enemies play a part of the fractured mind of each game's protagonist really helped Silent Hill become as big of a mainstay in the horror genre as Resident Evil. And son of a bitch, as someone whose favorite franchise is Resident Evil, I'd still go out of my way to say that Silent Hill does horror a fuck ton better than Resident Evil. Now, while Silent Hill wasn't as successful as something like Resident Evil, that doesn't matter because it introduced an entire new concept to horror to an already existing audience, and it was able to become as big of a household name, eventually getting a shit ton of sequels itself. And this is where we now find our favorite genre in a very interesting spot, because now with the more advanced technology allowing for much better graphics and sound, and this was also the point where gaming itself jumped from a niche hobby to an industry giant, now more games than ever were trying to capitalize on what Resident Evil and Silent Hill were able to accomplish. Though I can imagine that the landscape of horror was still kind of hard to really get into because Capcom and Konami were still releasing games in the Resident Evil and Silent Hill franchise, so I can imagine that competition was still steep, with only the exception of a few games really being able to stand out. But during this time, I'd say that the early to mid 2000s were probably the best time to be a survival horror fan, because aside from getting entry into the two biggest horror franchises at the time, some smaller series were able to release, like The Suffering, a more third-person shooter approach to the horror genre, with the main theme of the game being on the psyche of the main character and enemies being themed after different forms of execution. There was also Obscure, a game that had a pretty interesting mechanic of you being able to play as a bunch of different characters, each having their own special abilities, as well as having the ability to play the game with a friend. And how many horror games do you know that has Sum 41 in the intro? But while these games were fun in their own right, they pretty much dropped off the face of the earth after the second game. But there was thankfully one series that was able to survive and live a pretty healthy life after its inception, and that was Fatal Frame. I'm not really gonna go into too much detail, but it essentially is a franchise that takes elements from both Resident Evil and Pokemon Snap. But not only is this the first game in the genre to be set primarily in Japan, but instead of actual physical entities you need to watch out for, Fatal Frame sets you with the task of you needing to defend yourself against ghosts. And how do you do that? You become the paparazzi. Now, during the early to mid 2000s, while we got a shit ton of games attempting to throw their own hat in the ring with the survival horror name stapled to it, you may realize that the genre itself hasn't really evolved as much as you would think. We mainly were still having a bunch of games with fixed camera angles, town settings, puzzles, and all that type of shit. But all in all, the genre itself was starting to really blend into one another at this point. While the games we got during this time were still good, I mean, we literally still got games like Resident Evil's remake and Silent Hill 2, 3, and 4, so we were still eating good.
And with there being so many different games just coming in and trying to copy the already established formula, it was a little bit of a time for a change, right? And fucking hell, that change did come, and it left a giant cum stain.
Say hello to Resident Evil 4, ladies and gentlemen. If the genre hasn't innovated before, then it sure as hell has now. Even more so than Resident Evil 1, Resident Evil 4 absolutely revolutionized not only the survival horror genre, but gaming as a whole. Gone were the fixed camera angles and pre-rendered backgrounds this series was always known for. Nah fam, over here, we get to see the world of Resident Evil in a way that it's never been seen before. Unless we forget that this game actually did it first. Yeah, Resident Evil 4 was the one game that propelled the survival horror genre into new heights and set the new standard as to what every single horror game should be focusing on in the future. And if you can believe it, 4 was the one game that propelled Resident Evil into the mainstream like it's never seen before. Believe me when I say it, a fuck ton of people knew what Resident Evil was, but everybody knew what Resident Evil 4 was. But now, this is where things start to kinda go south. Resident Evil 4, to me at the very least, isn't really a horror game. Don't get me wrong, if we were gonna go off of what horror is by definition, then yes, 100% Resident Evil 4 ticks off every box.
Before you go out of the way to light your pitchforks and sharpen your torches, Resident Evil 4 2005 is one of my favorite games of all time. And before I went out of my way to play the succeeding games in the series like 7, the remakes, Village, stuff like that, Resident Evil 4 always somewhat remained one of my favorite games in the entire franchise, and depending on what mood you catch me in, I would still go out of my way and tell you that Resident Evil 4 is still my favorite game in this entire franchise, more so than the actual remake.
But with its shift to a more action-oriented style of gameplay, gone is the genuine fear and horror that this series once relished in. But I don't think that you need me to really explain what Resident Evil's 4 success spelled for the rest of the series. It's like I've mentioned before many times, even in other videos before. While Resident Evil 4 is one of the best games to ever grace gaming as a medium, it is, in my opinion, why I think that the survival horror genre started taking a nosedive after it released. But Resident Evil 4 wasn't the sole reason why I think shit really started hitting the fan for the genre after its launch. It's where the entire gaming industry as a whole was going in general. And we only need to look 2 years into the future to see the beginning of the end. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, 2007 was probably one of the most revolutionary times to be a gamer. Not only was this the first proper year we've jumped into the 7th generation of consoles, but this was a time where graphics were the most realistic we've ever seen at the time. New IPs were getting released into the world that set the industry on fire, and already existing franchises were jumping over to this new generation. And the one game that came from a pretty niche franchise that jumped into the 7th generation, and then holy shit, the new norm for gaming was finally set in stone. And what game am I talking about, ladies and gentlemen? Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare. Yes, much like Resident Evil, it's pretty hard to think that once upon a time that Call of Duty was a pretty small franchise. But after Call of Duty 4, I don't think I need to explain the impact that it had on its own genre and franchise, but gaming as a whole. Because once the trend is set, everybody's gonna want a piece of that market share. And unfortunately, our beloved horror franchises suffered because of this. Because next up after Resident Evil 4 was obviously Resident Evil 5. A game that took the core gameplay elements of its predecessor, refined them, and then ultimately decided to say to hell with horror altogether. And sales spoke. At the time, Resident Evil 5 was the highest selling Resident Evil game at the time. And whilst I'm not sure how much of those sales are thanks to Resident Evil 4's success, the fact that the game was jumping on the brand new action trend set by Call of Duty, I'm pretty sure that a large part of the market jumped onto Resident Evil 5 solely for that reason. The only game that was still able to shine through this transition away from survival horror and into action was none other than Dead Space, EA's crack at trying to cash in on the survival horror market. But as we all know, even this great one would fall victim to the changing trends at the time. And this is where we finally enter what some people would call a drought in survival horror, which I never really understood myself because of the release of a game that would revolutionize modern survival horror, Amnesia: The Dark Descent, released all the way back in 2010.
Now, this is a term that I've heard a lot over the years on the internet, but apparently it would seem between the time frame of 2005 and 2013, survival horror really came off to be a sort of a dead genre, which is something that I never really understood.
If we're talking about genre mainstays like Resident Evil and Silent Hill, I can definitely understand that. But once again, if we were to look at the release windows between Resident Evil 5 and Amnesia, my brother, it was released only a year after, so where the fuck was this drought you were all on about? Now, if you've played Amnesia, then I'm pretty sure you know the gist of everything. But when we compare it to the survival horror games that came out before, Amnesia kind of went back in one major way. While it still did retain the signature horror elements with its atmosphere, emphasis on exploration and puzzle solving, Amnesia was the first instance of a horror game that completely axed the ability for your main character to defend themselves, which added a layer of tension that we haven't ever really seen before in any game. We now went from needing to stock up on ammo to make sure we didn't get vored, to now where if we see a nudist running towards us, we needed to haul our ass and find the nearest hiding spot if we didn't want to get added to some medieval obituary. And another thing that Amnesia placed emphasis on was your main character's sanity. If you spend way too long in the dark or stare too long at the nasties that wanted to come for your ass, all sorts of weird shit would start happening to the game that'll completely throw you off. And the only way to combat this is to find some light, either already lit, or either need to light them yourselves with a limited supply of tinder boxes, which plays into the limited resources mechanic of survival horror's past. But this new way of not being able to defend yourself seems to have set the new standard for modern horror games going forward. And in 2013, the new face of the survival horror genre was released into the world, Outlast. This game is probably the Resident Evil 4 for at the time modern survival horror games. Everything from its setting to the enemies to the fact that it still played into the whole not being able to defend yourself aspect, emphasizing more hiding than fighting, and having stuff like limited supplies like batteries for your flashlight and bandages to heal you when shit gets hairy. And the only way that you were able to traverse the darkness of Mount Massive Asylum is through the lens of your camera's night vision mode, creating one of the most distinct looks for any horror game. Outlast, much like Amnesia, was one of the sole reasons as to why survival horror games were able to flourish again in the early 2010s. And it would seem that this new revolutionary direction that horror was taking at the time's momentum just wouldn't stop, because one single year later in 2014, we were introduced to none other than the furry fandom's favorite fuck toy, Five Nights at Freddy's, a game that proves how well horror can work with humongous limitations set by an engine. I've already made a massive video on FNAF going into specific details as to why I love this game and why it was such a revolutionary entry for the horror genre, so I'll leave that linked in the description if you want to go ahead and take a look at it.
Now, I do understand that I'm spending a lot of time talking about the overall history of survival horror, but I just wanted you guys to understand the turbulent history that this genre had with gamers before we got to the point where we are today. Plus, the watch time's also really nice.
Now, you may be also wondering to yourself where our beloved horror franchises were while all of this kind of stuff was going down. And let's just say, they weren't doing all too hot. When it comes to money, hell yes, brother, Capcom was raking in all of the cash. But much like Kenneth at the beginning of Resident Evil 1, the entire series was just now a mere shadow of its former self. But after what I'm assuming were a lot of missteps for the franchise, especially when you take into consideration that Umbrella Corps was the last game released in the series before Capcom threw their hands up in the air and said, alright, we gotta make some changes. Thankfully, in 2017, we got the game that returned the series to the top spot of survival horror with Resident Evil 7. Now, I'm gonna be completely honest with you here. This entire history section has probably been going on for 25 minutes, so I don't really want to waste any more of your time talking about the history of survival horror games, because I'm pretty damn sure you know at this point, after Resident Evil 7, Resident Evil finally got itself back on the right track with its new entries and remakes, and we've even now got a shit ton of indie devs that will always throw their hat in the ring to show what this genre still has to offer. And now, as of 2024, I'm very happy to say that at the very least, Konami was able to come back out swinging with the release of Silent Hills 2 remake. So we are now pretty much living in an era where I'm very happy to say we are so back. But before we get into why I think that survival horror games are an addiction, I think it's time we dive into what this monumental genre actually is. Now, throughout the many years survival horror games have existed, the status quo seems to have shifted quite a lot as to what defines a game in this genre. I understand that sounded awfully philosophical coming from me, but it just seems that nowadays what a lot of people will view as survival horror may vary based on who you ask and what their first experience with the genre was. So I'm gonna take it from the top and try my best to explain what I personally think a survival horror game is. Survival horror games are horror games where you need to survive. So if we were to go off on the most agreed upon opinion as to what survival horror games actually are, it's a game genre that places a large emphasis on exploring whatever messed up location the devs decided to conjure up after doing Fent, finding key items that'll open up more of said location to further advance the story, completing a bunch of puzzles that'll end up doing the exact same thing as finding keys to progress the plot, and gathering resources to help you survive the hellscape you've just wandered into. And these resources can come in the form of stuff that range from medical items like health kits and Vaseline, or ammo for whatever weapon you're able to find lying around. Hell, even in the genre's inception, even something like saving was a resource that you needed to keep track of, because Capcom didn't really care if you spent your life savings on that memory card, you needed to earn the right to save, you little prick. And the best way to describe the structure of these kinds of games are basically you starting out on whatever the setting is that the game chose for you, you needing to maybe fight one or two enemies when you start out, you explore a little bit until you hit a roadblock, you backtrack to your already explored locations until you miraculously find the fucking thing you've been running past this whole entire time to progress, head back to the roadblock, successfully pass said roadblock, and Bob's your uncle, you get to repeat the cycle all over again. Only this time it's in a separate location. Now I do understand that might sound a little bit repetitive if you describe it that way, but at the very least said repetitive structure is slightly mitigated a bit once you realize that the scenario shifts constantly so that everything doesn't really feel all too samey. Couple that with the awesome feeling of progression with the game's story continuously unfolding, you getting to fight a shit ton of different enemies, get more weapons and stuff like that as the game progresses, there's a reason that this kind of a gameplay style feels so damn rewarding. The best way how I can describe old school survival horror games is that they're pretty much like advanced level puzzle games, because if there's going to be something that you'll probably get caught stuck doing the most in these kinds of games, is definitely these things. It's just now, instead of basically just having to complete the puzzle at your own pace, there's a bunch of assholes trying to make your life as hard as possible while you're trying to do it. But you may have noticed that I've mentioned that this is the best way I can describe old school survival horror games. When it comes to a more modern style of survival horror games, they pretty much contain the exact same kind of structure as old school games, only now this time with the caveat that you now have fuck all way of keeping your ass safe from enemies aside from hiding away from them. Another aspect to these kinds of horror games is that they forego the normal structure of exploration found in old school survival horror games in favor of a more linear structure, which, if I'm being completely honest here, depending on what kind of game we're talking about, I honestly think that a more linear style of game is actually a lot better when it comes to the overall pacing of certain games. But now that we have the structure and overall gameplay of these kinds of games out of the way, I want to go into a lot more detail discussing each element as to what make these games so unique and special in their own ways. A huge aspect of horror games is the setting that each of these games take place in. Whether it be a mansion in the woods, a city that's fallen into chaos after whatever outbreak caused shit to happen, some poor guy's apartment, or fucking outer space, a thing that I absolutely love about horror games is the way that they can take these seemingly ordinary locations, somewhat, and bend them in a way that creeps the ever-living shit out of the player, and even more so than the actual story of the game itself and its characters, because sometimes the location themselves can be a major character in the game's overall events. Because once you take a look at the aspects of each game's settings, they may look ordinary on the surface, but each of them can hold their own little lore secrets that make you wonder about the history of the place itself, and what secrets it might hold, why certain things were built the way that they were, and just so much more. And usually a thing that I really love about the settings in horror games is that most of these questions you might end up having based on the game you're playing, these questions may end up getting answered if you explore hard enough, because whether or not it's diary entries scattered throughout the place or voice messages, it'll almost always give you an idea around the place you're exploring, as well as the people that once inhabited it. I think it's pretty obvious that the best examples for locations that just ooze character are the Spencer Mansion from the original Resident Evil and the entire town of Silent Hill, and an even more recent example being Castle Brennenburg from Amnesia: The Dark Descent, or Mount Massive Asylum from the original Outlast. Hell, if we were to go even further beyond, you can easily also look to places like the Ishimura from Dead Space, or Sevastopol Station from Alien Isolation, being equally as compelling of locations to explore because of how well they're designed and what secrets there are still left to uncover. Basically, I think that one massive important aspect to nail in a survival horror game is definitely its setting, because it'll play a huge part of hiding whatever horrors and secrets each game is going to reveal in due time. But none of these locations would nearly be as effective at all if it wasn't for another humongous aspect of horror games, and that is simply known as when it comes to any horror game, and hell, maybe just games in general, if there's one thing that'll help you get immersed in its setting, it's definitely without a doubt the atmosphere. Once again, when it comes to the setting of each place, whether it just be a house, a city that went to shit, an abandoned Japanese village, or just a foggy town with no one in sight, nailing the atmosphere in a horror game is one of, if not the most important things if you want to immerse your players in the world you've created. Now listen, I am a moron. I do understand after such epic writing that'll even make Eminem shiver, I come off like a smartass that acts like he knows way more than he actually does, but in reality, when it comes to atmosphere of a game, what works for a game's atmosphere or what doesn't for you is rather subjective, because I feel when it comes to an atmosphere, there are a shit ton of aspects that come into play for me to just cover in one section. But for me personally, I feel that an immersive atmosphere to me, first and foremost, is definitely more focused on the immersion aspect. Like the best way how I can describe the perfect perfect kind of atmosphere for me personally is if a game allows for a massive sense of believability with how you get to interact with the world around you. Now, I'm not just talking about knocking over a chair, opening drawers and lockers by hand in something like Amnesia. That's all well and good and is one part of something that I absolutely adore that those games allow me to do. But what I'm talking about when it comes to overall believability in a game's world comes from a little game called System Shock, particularly the first game's remake and the second game. Now, these are two games I absolutely adore and were a slight addiction of mine somewhere around the middle of this year. Who knows, maybe a future video. Now, this was a game franchise that I would argue was probably the most immersed I ever felt playing a video game, period. Everything from interaction with stuff in the environment, the inventory management, interaction with lore tidbits like emails and voice messages, every single aspect of these games just pulled me into the world because I absolutely can see that this is how this world would function if it existed in real life. I guess that's why they call these types of games immersive sims. Good job, guys, you definitely lived up to your name. Basically, I feel the perfect type of atmosphere that a game can give me is giving me a lot of options to increase the overall believability of the setting. But another aspect of the atmosphere in games that I've recently realized I absolutely adore is just let me take some time and explore every single little detail in the environment. I've recently figured this out after playing out of all things Assassin's Creed Odyssey, that I just love exploring these kinds of locations to see every tiny little detail the developers added to each of these locations. And couple that with other games like Witcher 3, GTA, Red Dead, Dying Light, and other games that just encourage a large level of exploration, it just gave me a larger appreciation for the time and dedication the devs put into crafting these worlds. And if we were to go off on the horror side of things, I think that the game that absolutely nailed this feeling of exploration was the recently released Silent Hill 2 remake. Now, I'll be damned, Konami and Bloober Team did not shit the bed with this entry. But before I continue with this section, it's only appropriate to mention two things. This will contain spoilers for Silent Hill 2's remake because no shit, and secondly, do not spoil the game for either me or anyone in the comments section because despite how much I've been loving this game, I have still yet to beat it for myself. Because A, would you believe I have a life outside of YouTube, and B, I just genuinely want to experience this game to the best of my abilities, so I want zero distractions and zero bullshit like a Viagra website that'll tell you if you take their pill, your manhood will be a size worth a damn. So please, no spoilers or else I'll come to your house and lecture you on why what you did was naughty. Basically, from the minute I started the game, there was just something about exploring this new rendition of the 2001 classic that I just wanted to take my time. I was just in complete awe of how good everything in the game looked, the tiny details that the new engine allowed me to take in. And this was one of the very first games in the horror genre where I just wanted to axe the idea of running from point A to point B to finish up an objective as fast as possible, which I still ended up doing because would you believe I have other stuff I'd like to do in my life? But just take things slowly. Look at every single thing that the devs made to bring this world of Silent Hill into the next generation, and appreciate every tiny little detail that was crammed in here, only to be met with a prick wearing a Millennium puzzle on his head having fun with the mannequin enemy, so I guess that means my day is just ruined. On to the fucking next part. Another aspect as to what makes a horror game's atmosphere stand out like no other is each game's sound design, or sometimes the lack thereof. Now, whether it be the game's soundtrack or just the overall sounds that emanate from whatever may or may not be in the room with you, sound is probably one of the most important aspects to any horror game. Now, once again, you may have a different opinion on what constitutes as perfect sound design in a horror game, but for me personally, I really just like it when everything is silent, nothing but the ambient sound of whatever is in the room with you, and the footsteps echoing throughout the room breaking the dead silence. It's not to say that musical pieces can't be good in horror games, far from it. I'd somewhat argue that certain instances you absolutely need music to set a proper tone for whatever area you're inside. The best example of this being, I'd probably argue, any save room from the Resident Evil franchise, giving you this awesome blend of both safety and helplessness all in one single track. My personal favorite from the entire franchise is without a doubt Resident Evil 3's save room theme. Oh, and let's not forget the absolute GOAT for perfect musical composition that perfectly not only reflects the game and its setting, but survival horror as a whole. On the same console though, I think you'd be hard pressed to find anyone who'd forget the absolute perfect compositions by the legendary Akira Yamaoka for the original Silent Hill, where bro can make a damn proper song evident by the game's opening theme. Nah dude, we talk about this over here. I would genuinely argue that if you need music in your horror game, this is sure as shit how you do it right. This is just noise, a cacophony of different shit that isn't something you'll find in any shitty ASMR channel on YouTube, but perfectly captures the feeling of tension and overwhelmingness that these games cause you to feel. And I feel that Silent Hill 1 still is the master of creating shit that captures the feeling of fear in any music track. But I'm gonna be showing off one of the new kids on the block that I would argue did sound design almost perfect as well. A little game called Murder House. Now this is probably one of the best horror games I've played, period, and it really makes me want to take a look and see what else Puppet Combo was able to cook up. But if there's two instances in the game that I want to give a shout out to for just pure sound design, it's without a doubt in the intro in the mall, and when you notice that your tires and your entire car is fucked on the outside. But I don't even think I really need to explain why the sound design, I'd argue, is perfect in these sections of the games. I'll just let you listen to it for yourself. Let me tell you one thing, if there's a way to keep a player constantly on edge and not know what to expect, you do shit like this. Now, I didn't really find this game all too scary for myself personally. That is, unless if you find the idea of a furry holding a sickle horrifying, then you know what, more power to you. But let me tell you, when you play a sound that's as unnerving and flippin' constant like this, a sound that you can't even begin to describe what it represents, nor what the actual sound is supposed to be, that absolutely creeps me the fuck out, and I wanted to put the controller down and compose myself a few times when one of these eerie pieces of whatever it's supposed to be started playing. It was just absolutely unnerving. So if you needed to have sound mixed with any survival horror game, just make it something as unnerving as the stuff that I've played you here.
But there is one aspect to horror game sound design that I have failed to mention, but I don't even really think that I need to go into too much detail as to why it's so effective on a lot of people, and also why it's a little bit controversial in the horror space. And I honestly think to explain my point, it's just better if I... Yeah, there you go, jump scares. I'm not sorry.
Now, we've talked about mechanics, we've talked about settings, we've even talked about the noise. But no survival horror game would be complete without the one thing that you need to survive against, and that is whatever enemy the game throws at you. And I'm not sure if anybody has really sat down to think about this, but what makes a survival horror game antagonist scary goes way deeper than what you might think. But let's not get too far ahead of ourselves yet. Whether it be the shambling corpses of those who once walked among the living, to people tortured to the point where reason is no longer something they have a grasp of, to these warped and twisted things that might once have been human, but are just now a moldy mass of flesh that barely resemble who they once were, to just these indestructible monsters that you have no hope of fighting back against, a good enemy and a healthy variety of them is easily what makes a great horror game. But there is way more to a good enemy than just like in something like Resident Evil, having zombies be your main foe for 90% of the game, and then just out of nowhere, this twist scaly with an incredibly massive cake takes its place to give you a new challenge. Those definitely work from a gameplay point of view, and we've already discussed how an enemy's sound design plays a huge part in setting an unsettling atmosphere, but I think there's two more things that just make an excellent enemy for a horror game, and that's their designs as well as the lore behind them. Firstly, obviously, when it comes to the design of an enemy, what you may find scary will obviously be subjective, but I still think it's pretty obvious when something looks disturbing. Like, for instance, I'm gonna give another shout out to some new kids on the block, and that comes from two games known as Still Wakes the Deep and Crow Country. Two of the best games I've played all year, by the way, and both being perfect examples of how well both retro and modern horror can work pretty damn well in the gaming space. Now, in Still Wakes the Deep, much like any modern horror game, you aren't really capable of defending yourselves, but unlike a lot of those horror games, enemy encounters are not as frequent as you might think, which already is perfect because I'd say that every single enemy encounter you'll have in this game means that they'll always be memorable. But what makes these enemies disturbing in their design is that they're just this mound of flesh with protruding tentacles being their only way of navigating around the places they're occupying. And what makes these enemies both scary and tragic at the same time is that they still keep the personalities of the person who got infected, making it even sadder to see these people get possessed by this otherworldly mutation, and makes you constantly question whether or not these people still could have been saved. Crow Country, on the other hand, isn't equally as deep, but the enemies you do end up facing have their own disturbing backstory when you're finally able to put two and two together, while also still having these equally disturbing designs to them. So another spoiler warning here for Crow Country. You see, what makes these enemies so damn scary, aside from their overall design, is when you actually end up learning what these creepy fucks are. You see, sometimes while you're busy exploring, you'll see the numbers 2106 plastered throughout the park, and it's not until the very end of the game where you finally learn that these numbers aren't for a code or anything, it's a date. These things you've been killing are actually people that came from the year 2106, and they're actually trying to warn us of a disease that'll end up destroying the world in that time. And these enemies weren't even really trying to kill us, they were trying to warn us, but they can't speak for shit because of the main antagonists meddling with the method that they use to travel back in time, leaving them as these fleshy masses that can't do anything but moan these horrific sounds. It's such a fucking cool twist that actually adds a layer of tragedy because of the fact that we've been killing normal people who just couldn't speak and didn't even really want to try and hurt us. It's moments like these that I say make a fantastic enemy if there's a large level of lore attached to them. Another game I'm gonna give a shout out to is none other than The Suffering. As I've mentioned all the way back in the beginning of these videos, the enemies you face in this game are both represented of the shady shit the prison got up to before the game's main events, and they represent the various different forms of execution that the inmates were subjected to. The most recent example as well I can think of that should be obvious from the start comes from Outlast, because as we know, we have the Murkoff Corporation hiding in the shadows while the events of the game takes place. The various enemies that you'll end up encountering in the asylum really makes you think of all the fucked up shit that this place caused for them to end up as these broken husks that once resembled people. I guess the most obvious example as well is Silent Hill, most definitely Silent Hill 2, where once again, these enemies are all disturbing to all hell, but they each represent something about the main character that encounters them, and how Silent Hill takes their psyche and molds it into actual physical horrors that you need to take care of. So basically, much like whatever settings these horror games take place in, enemies that are equally as fleshed out and actually make you think, I'd say is one of the most important aspects as to creating an amazing horror game enemy, aside from them just being imposing in their own right, like Nemesis or Mr. X for example.
I'm just gonna start off this section by saying a humongous thank you to everybody who stuck all the way to the end of this video. This was a massive project, as I'm sure you can no doubt tell. And I do hope that this video's length is indicative to how much I absolutely love this genre. And hopefully it gives you something extra to think of next time you launch Doki Doki Literature Club. But with all of that out of the way, let's finish this video, shall we?
What is it that makes survival horror games such a massive addiction? Well, I'm just gonna say it like it is. Much like when I covered Soulslikes, there just isn't anything that can properly replicate the feeling that survival horror games give us. Not on just a simple base level of, oh, I see a spooky, my pants are shitted in, oh fuck.
You are paying for the fucking dry cleaning.
But because of the sheer variety that there is in this genre, there is literally also something for anybody here who wants to spend a night in the darkness and immerse themselves in a world of horror that something like even films aren't able to replicate. Whether or not you just want to be alone in this unforgiving world with no way of defending yourself, just trying your best to hide away from the threats that's after your ass, or if you just want to use that last bullet to take out the thing that's been pursuing you for the entire game, it just once again gives you that rush that no other genre can replicate. And even that feeling of satisfaction from beating a puzzle after exploring every nook and cranny for you to later get that aha moment is incredibly satisfying. But for me, while all of those elements I've just mentioned are ingredients as to why I find horror games so damn addicting, it's a genre that really just has a lot more going on under the hood than just normal spooks and sandwiches. No, some of these games really just make you think by incorporating elements of lore to the world or to the enemies you'll be facing, but honestly, something I haven't really mentioned, sometimes the themes that some of these games tackle are pretty damn compelling and really gives you something to think about once the credits roll. A lot of games can tackle a fuck ton of stuff that other games wouldn't really be able to cover, like mental health, abuse, and all sorts of shit that unfortunately are real problems that we face in the world. And horror games are just an outlet that allows us to see what the developers' interpretations of these kinds of problems in their own artistic way. And I think that's absolutely something that makes playing horror games worthwhile. Now, there is unfortunately one sad thing about all of this though. While you can appreciate everything like the lore, the enemies, the gameplay, and all sorts of stuff like that, unfortunately, you really won't be able to ever experience every single aspect that makes a horror game special once everything is said and done. The spooks, the surprises, everything just turns into a checklist once everything is said and done. And I think that's probably the one only real issue with horror games. But at the same time, that's okay, because the experiences you had in those games are pretty much rewarded, because they just reward you for the amount of dedication you put into them. But also on the bright side, if you're starting to grow a little bit tired of one particular game, whether you're itching for some classic fixed camera angles, first-person spooks, or fuck it, even 8-bit throwbacks to what these games were trying to be when they started out, there's no short supply of great horror games waiting for you for whenever you need something that needs to scratch that addiction.